Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of January 11th, 2021. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Today marks the podcast return from a holiday winter break hiatus, and not coincidentally, I should say, the return of the Texas legislature as lawmakers gather in Austin today to kick off the 87th Texas legislature. I'm joined this week by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks for having me back.
Are you excited about the beginning of the legislature?
I'm always excited about the beginning of the legislature.
Oh,
it'll get, we'll see. The question really is, I think from now on, you should ask me, are you still excited about the legislature? We'll try that question later.
I think the funny thing about that is that, as is, I think, kind of universal in people that are engaged with this, you get kind of cranked up for the beginning of it, even if you're jaded and cynical, and then nothing happens for a long time, which I think we'll be probably talking about, if not by next week, certainly by the week after.
We have this conversation, it seems. I mean, it's always like around these transition periods, but when the legislature starts, I'm pumped for the legislature. I get less and less pumped as time goes on. I get disgusted at a few points, scared. But then it ends, and then I think, God, I can't wait for elections to start. And then we get to the elections. By the end of the election, I'm like, God, can we just get to the legislature? So it's sort of this it's a whipsaw effect. But for brief periods of time, I'm very excited. This is one of them.
Yeah. I think what I've learned, at least about myself over time, is that I have a lot more sustained interest in the legislature probably than I do in elections. By the time elections are over, I'm really ready for elections to be over, even though there is that bit of, excitement and curiosity about how it's actually going to turn out, which, elections actually have going for them. But nonetheless, usually by about mid-October, I just can't wait for it to. Usually about the time early voting starts, I'm kind of like, yeah, this could just be over now. I wish they were just voting today. So speaking of elections, a lot has happened since our last podcast of 2020 in mid-December. Most notably, the violence at the U.S. Capitol the day of the ratification of the Electoral College vote, which, as we record this, was last week. We'll no doubt talk about that some, since is one of the more consequential things of our lifetimes. But we do want to start and kind of frame this discussion with the context of the legislature and the factors and forces that we expect to loom over the politics of the legislative process as it unfolds, at least initially over the next 140 days, though I think there's universal anticipation of a at least one special session for redistricting, which we'll touch on. So I think we begin where we begin so many of these discussions, which is with the partisan polarization and the fragmentation in the political system in Texas, which is, really now to some degree overshadowed by what's going on nationally, but nonetheless has been present in Texas for a long time, has shaped legislative politics for quite some time, and I think is looming over the opening of the legislature today. I think, in some ways most directly in, the fact that there is, as we go into this, there has been a lot of concern about whether there would be protests, unrest outside the legislature, given what we know about apparent threats to all 50 state capitals in the wake of what happened at the national capitol last week. At least thus far today, knock on wood, while there have been, some protesters present at the opening of the legislature, There doesn't seem to have, been much of a materialization of big protests, but nonetheless, the polarization is really hovering over this, and partisan politics are really hovering over this. I mean, what comes to mind for you, Josh, when you think about what we're expecting on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's two things that I've been thinking about in the context of polarization, and the legislature right now. I mean, I think one is, how quaint is the idea that the Texas legislature is a little bit different? I mean, you prefaced it with the fact that, like, look, partisan polarization is a part of politics at this point. It always is. In some ways, there's a little bit, like everything Texas related, there's a certain amount of Texas pride, justified or not, around the fact that Texas, does things a bit differently. By differently, that, what people are usually saying when they say it's like, they say, well, it's less partisan then. They point to the fact that, there'll be Democratic committee chairs in the Republican controlled House as an example. There might be Democratic vice chairs in the Republican controlled Senate as another example. And then the thing that, I've been thinking about a lot that people bring up so consistently is that, and I think the now Speaker Phelan brought up in his interview with Ross Reams, or not with Evan Smith yesterday, the Tribune.
The shorter one.
The shorter one. Well, it's not, first of all, between the two of us here, with one of us being very tall and one of us being not, I'm going to defend Evan.
That was a little
say,
meta. Okay.
No, I'm going to defend Evan in that and say Evan is average, just like me.
That time Josh defended Evan
as being average. Yes. But Speaker Phelan brought up yesterday this idea that I've heard a lot, which is, there's a lot of issues that don't really fall along partisan lines. What people usually refer to is issues that fall along urban-rural lines. And I guess one of the things I'm wondering going into this session is, like, how much is that really going to be the case? I mean, there's a really basic logic to that in my mind. It's usually around education, but it's really also about resource allocation ultimately. If you have a highway funding formula, transportation plan, you have a water plan, you have education funding formulas, ultimately, geography and access is going to have a bigger impact than partisanship on issues like that. But, I wonder as we head into this session, and also as the parties are becoming so clearly associated either with being urban or not, and as that becomes so sort of suffused in the politics, I wonder how easy it is to maintain it. So that's sort of the first thing I'm thinking about in terms of the effect of polarization on the legislative session.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's kind of always and everywhere been kind of dependent on the agenda, and there's a certain we've seen a certain rhythm to that in the last few sessions in which there have been periods where people have felt like it was going very well, and there wasn't a lot of there wasn't a lot of partisan conflict, or it was at least kept to manageable levels and predictable. And depending on how far back, you go, it could be something like, oh, look, everyone's getting along on water, or, in the last session, everybody's focused on education and wants to move the ball forward. But, I find that is always precarious. All you really have to do is bring, a sanctuary cities bill to the floor, or an abortion bill to the floor. Yeah. Or, in this sense, we're going to be talking about that will, and it will be muted, but I think that hovering over this session will be redistricting, which is a hornet's nest of self-interest, partisanship, and as we wrote in a piece today, race and racial politics. So, all of these things are always, so they're a bit dependent on what the agenda is and what's getting attention at the moment. And I think that this is going to sound like we're kicking the Republicans around, but it's been true of Democrats, I think, in the past, and, kind of the previous party system in the state. And, the kind of bomb throwers on each side know this. Mm-hmm. And so, when you find issues that are divisive, a lot of time, or you find open conflict in the House or the Senate, a lot of the time it's because it's being driven by people that are trying to push an agenda that is disruptive. And so I think that's one of the big questions that we're going to have going forward this time is whether that will continue or not.
Well, and the thing is,
who will shape the agenda to some degree.
Yeah, there's a who will shape the agenda, but the other piece of it is something, an aspect of this, which is, with and we'll get to this probably, but with the revenue estimate out yesterday and essentially about the same amount of money available this time as last time, which essentially means less money due to population growth and, of course, the increasing needs associated with COVID and the economic fallout. The sort of, let's say, polarization, softening that usually seems to occur around resource allocation around the
Yeah.
state. Ultimately, there's not going to be resources to allocate. This isn't a year in which you're going to see a big water bill or a big transportation bill or a big education bill. What you're going to see is a lot of people trying to make things less bad than they could be. But also this speaks to your thing, which is, if you're looking ahead to the 2022 elections, which ultimately everybody, who's in politics is, even if they say they aren't, it's these sorts of issues that you're bringing up, the divisive abortion bill, some sort of a sanctuary cities bill, something having to do with gun access or, gun control, whatever, that members put forward to be able to achieve political goals that ultimately in a session where they're not going to have a lot of opportunities.
Well, and they are harder to, engage in kind of divisible politics in the way that financial issues are. And fiscal issues. At the end of the day, whether there's a lot of money to hand out, or finances are tight, when it comes down to the final, crunch on trying to put together winning coalitions, if you need to do that, or to disincentivize disruptive forces, who try to use, if you will, the legislative weapons of the weak to scuttle or thwart majorities. It's just easier to do that when you are talking about, fiscal issues that are ultimately divisible. It's hard to engage in distributive politics and in, horse trading when you are trying to balance issues of racial justice, shall we say,
for example.
Let's we might as well, since you started that, we might as well just stick with that a little bit. So in terms of the budget,
can I just do one other thing on polarization real quick?
Yeah,
Is
sure.
it okay?
Yeah.
The other thing I've just been thinking about is, that was an internal consideration, right? I mean, the way in which the legislature either does or does not sort of foment this, polarization we see elsewhere. The sort of an external looking thing that I wonder about going forward, which is, when you look at polarization at the national level, I mean, we had this conversation about this earlier in the week. It's really remarkable how devoid of content it is. There's some very big, sort of the issues we're talking about. There's some big issues like gun control,
devoid
social
of policy
justice
content. Yeah,
just devoid of policy content. Yeah, but for the most part, the main thing that seems to drive polarization at the national level is really negative partisanship, right? It's really about negative attitudes towards the other side, real or imagined, right? I mean, whether, again, it's either whether they're justifiable or based, wholly on a very, let's say, contained media environment. Ultimately, it's this negative partisanship that's really driving things in a way that makes it so that you can't have compromise. You can't work on policy. It's a good example. Like everybody wants infrastructure at the national level. We can't have compromise between the parties is what it seems at this point. The question is, what I worry about is to what extent that suffuses the Texas process as time goes on. It's the first day of session and everybody's real happy and everybody's backslapping. You can watch the legislature, but how much do you keep insulated from some of these outside pressures that are exploding in really ugly ways at the national level?
Yeah. I guess I would think two things about that. I think, one, and I don't know if this is my own crankiness about this or my own,
I'll let you know.
The mood to be, the impulse to be contrary about Texans' views of themselves sometimes. I've always kind of felt like, this idea that, well, Texas is just so different because we have some Democratic chairs and, is a little bit overstated, to the extent that, the policy result of that has not been, a history, in the last decade or 15 years, a history of great bipartisan policy making or, a compromise in the composition or in the content of public policy or political discourse in the state. And so, well, that's all well and good. And I think that it does reflect a consensus on some of the fundamentals in the policy realm in the state that doesn't have a whole lot to do with the great comedy that everybody feels, or
Right.
so there's that, or comedy. So I mean, there's that, and then to the other point a bit, I think there is this sense, and this is kind of one of the underlying drivers of the piece we posted today. One of the things that is so troubling about the kind of hyper partisanship and polarization and the sorting of the parties that we're seeing at the national level right now is that and now, because of some of the reasons you talked about, the media environment, et cetera, it's almost like it's a structural force unto its own.
And that's the concern. I mean, that's why I say I wonder the extent to which we start to see a little bit more, I mean, nothing that's unfamiliar in Texas politics. I mean, ultimately, you are going to have, someone's going to file, just as an example, someone's going to file a constitutional carry bill this session if they haven't already. Right. And,
they
and that's,
already have.
Yeah, right. I'm sure they already have. So this is part and parcel of the process has always been, but the question is, does the group, who's demanding, let's say, absolute fealty, either on the left or the right, honestly, does that group grow in this session? Because we've kind of observed over time is sort of the group of the discontents within the governing majority has actually been shrinking.
Yeah. Right.
But I mean, until we actually see a session take place and actually see some votes, it's hard to really suss out how big that group is.
Yeah. And I guess as I think about the session, that we're looking at right now, there are two factors that help, I think, work counter to this, the growing structural force of hyperpartisanship and polarization, and one is just the realities of the legislative process in which people work over multiple sessions, over a period of time, over a period of conditions, on big public policy issues, or even on just their own issues to get things done. I mean, I think, you think about the progress on public education last time. Now, on one hand, we've sort of been a little snotty about people patting themselves on the back for making progress, but, it not exactly being a game changer per se. And so one thing I think we have to watch this time, and this is very much out in the ether, in the advocacy in the public interest world, but I think from an institutional perspective is, if we can hold the line on education and, if not, and we see some continuity from the last session in trying to do better on not just the amount of money going into public education, but in the structure of the funding process and just improving the way the jury-rigged public education funding system in the state works, well, then, that's a sign that something pretty good is going on, and a sign that, the deeper rhythms of the legislative process can continue. And I think, you can watch a whole range of other smaller issues on that, whether it's transportation, which we've been looking at more closely. Do people begin to, continue to chip away at some of the structural issues in transportation, particularly maybe some of the process things that aren't related or don't require a ton of money? Do they continue to hold the line on the progress that was made a few sessions ago on transportation? Even at the smaller level, does the marijuana decriminalization and legalization fight, and I hate to even mention that because it makes people all, starry-eyed.
Yeah.
But do you see a little more incremental movement on that suggests that the process is kind of working, in the incremental way? And I don't mean like, and I certainly don't expect any big moves on marijuana legalization per se, as long as Dan Patrick is lieutenant governor. But, does the list of medical uses get slightly expanded?
Right. Well, I mean,
do we see a little more progress on decrim? So all those things I think are kind of going on underneath in the legislature while we're thinking about these big forces of polarization. And I think that those big forces are troubling and influential, and as we wrote today, and color everything. But
Well,
there are counter forces out there.
yeah, I
But I
mean,
don't think those counter forces are because Texas is special. I think the counter forces, and I think it's important in the moment, are come from the way that democratic legislative politics work, however imperfect they are.
well, I mean, you raised the point, in the offset statement, right, that most of what the Texas legislature is dealing with is about business versus business issues. And these aren't necessarily monetary issues. I mean, for the legislature, these are about regulations. These are
They're
about
monetary for the stakeholders.
indirectly
Yeah. Well, they're not
monetary.
fiscal issues. They're not fiscal issues for
Right.
government in most
They're
cases.
not fiscal issues
Yeah.
for government, right? And so, I mean, ultimately, you bring the fact that is a big part of this, and I think part of the uncertainty in all this, I think that a lot of people are facing right now is I think it's safe to assume that all that stuff is going to keep happening, right? I mean, there's a lot of bills filed, a lot of things going on, but I think we're sitting here at the beginning of the session, you're thinking like, well, there's not going to be a lot of access to committee hearings, there might be a limited agenda, and then the other piece to this, which is floating out there is the question is, does something kind of derail this?
Yeah. And there's a lot of somethings out there right now.
Exactly. So what are some of these other somethings, I guess?
Right. Well, we've kind of skipped over a little bit the COVID pandemic, and I think that's skipped over, but we haven't gotten to that yet. And I think that in a lot of ways, the COVID pandemic is looming extremely large over the legislature. Although opening day, you don't get any kind of substantive indications, or you get very few. They're all heavily coded, and we saw a few references to the difficulties
Faced
of
by
the
business
last year from the speaker and from the governor, but not a lot of specifics. And again, I don't want to put too high a burden on what is essentially a ceremonial day, but I also think that there is going to be a fundamental confrontation at the legislature at some point between people that are, if not denying it, are, and we call them who they, they are going to be Republican elected officials for the most part, who have to manage part of their constituency that our polling has shown, and we've talked about multiple times on this podcast and in print and everywhere, have become, less and less convinced that the pandemic is a serious public health matter and a serious policy matter. And the reality that it remains a threat. And I think that is going to be out there. And I think that the presence of a vaccine now, complicates this in ways that are, ultimately really unfortunate. Obviously not that the presence of a vaccine is unfortunate. It's great.
No, but it's changed the calculus
in a pretty monumental way. But the fact that, the vaccine is not something that we can snap our fingers and, the human and physical and economic costs of the pandemic are just going to go away. And that's the timing of that with the legislature being in session, I fear gives Republican elected officials a way of avoiding conflict with a substantial minority of their base by waiting it out. And I think the costs of waiting it out are actually pretty awful.
What I'm waiting to see is whether the emphasis in terms of how the legislature addresses COVID, because remember, they haven't had a chance to really play a part in the state's response at all up until this point. And what I'm really curious about with respect to this is, how much is the emphasis of the legislation focused on, let's say fixing problems in terms of the state's response going forward, and how much of it is about correcting perceived missteps that have already taken place. And that could go in any direction, right? But in particular, what I'm thinking about here mostly is, I think there's going to be a lot of interest in keeping, local officials from overstepping some, arbitrary threshold in response to the pandemic. I think we're going to see a lot of that. And that's a way actually that, legislators while waiting out the pandemic can also address it, but in a way that's not really going to actually make the state more prepared going forward. It's actually just going to be, I think, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of hand tying of local officials at this point.
Well, right. I mean, I think what that speaks to is that, that is going to be, there's going to be a bucket of kind of institutional policy responses and implementation responses that are going to be, I think, probably all things being equal, uh, emanating mostly from the Republican Party in terms of the kinds of, they'll be billed as clarifications, but the kind of,
Mhm.
hamstringing of local authorities that you're talking about. And also then from a smaller subset of
Uh-huh.
Republican officials, but also some Democrats, efforts to, shall we say, clarify the limits of executive power in response to public health emergencies and emergencies writ large. And there have been bills introduced. There's already all kinds of bills filed in both of those areas. And then there will be another, bucket of bills that will be about ameliorating the effects and thinking more about public health policy and social policy in terms of the impact of the pandemic, that will speak to, if possible, the terms of funding and the structure of public health delivery and public health services, public health authorities. Um,
I'd
I
place my
think
money
that
on a
will
good
be
interim
mostly
study.
and that will be mostly in the realm of Democrats. And I would expect, just given the structure of the legislature, that first group of institutional measures is going to get much more attention from this legislature than that latter group of social policy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not to over elaborate the obvious, but I think that, but I also think that some of that is going to be a little bit contingent on the pace of vaccination
Mm-hmm.
and the path that the pandemic continues to take.
Well, I'd
And I think that's
also,
one, it's one of the reasons that it's both, good policy and good politics for the governor and the Republican-led executive branch right now to be doing everything they can to accelerate vaccination and,
right.
move this issue off the table,
Well, and it's
not to
not
be
as,
too bloodless about it.
yeah, and it's not as though, we're sitting here predicting, the emphasis of legislation. We're just talking about some of the possibilities. I would add, if after today's, opening day festivities, it turns out that a bunch of legislators come down with COVID, right? Or
Yeah.
even in the next few weeks, that's going to certainly, obviously, in addition to throwing the legislative session into, a certain complicated maneuvering space going forward, it also could affect the policy
Yeah,
process going
sure.
forward. Just right. All right.
Although, I think we can sometimes, I mean, we can sometimes overestimate the degree to which people's individual experiences then shape their, I mean,
I don't
at
think
least
they're
in terms of COVID,
I don't think their
but it may be
individual
the public
experiences,
discussion.
which it's the
Yeah.
public discussion. It's the idea of,
Yeah.
you've got a legislature where let's say 20 people come down with COVID in a couple week period. It changes the discussion about how they're behaving. So,
Well, and I think the other, unknown factor there is, how does the COVID policy discussion change in Texas as a result of the change in presidential leadership?
mhm.
And I think, look, there are again forces pressing in opposite directions in that way. On one hand, Donald Trump has been a powerful purveyor of minimizing the pandemic and minimizing the impact of the COVID and the seriousness of the pandemic. He will not have the bully pulpit he had before, and he will not have his Twitter account.
Well,
Interestingly enough, a
and
big
honestly, he'll
change
have a
since
lack
we
of
were together.
interest. I mean, he's already displayed a lack of interest, but ultimately, once it's not his
Well,
responsibility
his lack of
anymore,
I mean, but the thing is, his lack of interest was a presidential signal. His lack of interest will no longer be a presidential signal,
right?
So,
Yeah, it's
um,
his lack of
so
response is not a point of
so
discussion
there's
at this
that, but
point.
there may, but then we're also going to have to see how the relationship between rhetoric in Texas and rhetoric at the national level, you know, how they collide. I mean,
Well,
if
we
if the Biden administration comes in and really pushes hard on states and localities on public health policy, and the read in Texas is that pushback is called for, then Trump's absence gets sort of balanced by the fact that Texas political leadership reverts to the expected form and basically says the opposite of everything coming out of Washington D.C.
Well, and that's the other big, one of the other big contextual factors here, right? Is that, we've gone from Republican control of the presidency and the Senate to unified Democratic control in Washington. And as we wrote today, it's not too long ago that Governor Abbott was Attorney General Abbott saying that he wakes up every day and sues the Obama
Right.
administration, that was his job. Ultimately, we should expect an orientation back to that. We already brought up this idea, I think of the relationship between the legislature and the cities, which is, I think generously can be described as contentious at this point, mostly under Democratic control. And, I think you are bringing up the sort of overarching superstructure, which is the state's position vis-a-vis the federal government here is related to COVID. If the government takes a strong position on COVID, how reflexively are Texas political leaders just going to push back, right? And the effect that's going to have actually on fighting the virus is going to be interesting, right? Because at least when Donald Trump was in office, even if he was minimizing the virus, it was still in everybody's interest, especially, I would say, especially Republican executives around the country, to do a good job containing the virus and to really, work, even if quietly, to try to do the best they could under the circumstances. Now, they've got basically a fraction, not even a fraction, let's say, a faction within the party, right, that denies the reality of COVID, but also they're going to be hearing public health advice coming almost uniformly from Democrats. And I mean, really from a
Right.
Democratic administration.
Yeah.
So it really makes actually containment more complicated, within the
Yeah, no,
politics
that
of
was,
this. Yeah. Okay. We agree then.
I'm glad we got that worked out.
I wasn't sure, but now I know we do. Okay.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think that another facet of as we move forward on COVID and fighting the pandemic under these new conditions with Donald Trump absent the scene and a unified federal government under Democratic control or Democratic leadership anyway, is the template of race.
Mm-hmm.
You know, race has been, the discussion of race that emerged in the summer around policing, criminal justice, and the killing of George Floyd and the protest afterwards. We've written a lot about that. We wrote about it again today. That's also been a big factor in the COVID pandemic, given the disparate impact on communities of color. But it's also something that unfortunately, reinforces to some degree the cleavage because of the sorting of the partisan cleavage and partisanship because of the distribution, the racial composition of each of the parties.
Mm-hmm.
And so, race and is going to be hovering over this session. I mean, it's intrinsic to politics in the state. But I think it is going to be one of those things, and we kind of glancingly touched on this earlier, that is also going to be present in the session and is going to be probably impossible to downplay, even though I think that, obviously the majority party is going to want to do that.
Maybe. I mean,
at least in,
look,
well, other than the policing agenda, right?
Well, that's exactly, but that's the issue here, right? I mean, there's sort of two, fundamental difficulties with this issue in Texas and elsewhere, but I mean, it's really clear in Texas, right? Which is, for Democrats who overwhelmingly see problems with the relationships between police and the communities of color that they serve. Well, Republicans don't view that, or don't view this as a problem. And furthermore, Democrats are clearly much more likely also to sort of see, social justice issues more broadly than policing.
Right.
Ultimately, to the extent that, Democratic legislators feel, really beholden to their constituents, if not the moment, to make, good faith efforts to improve social justice after, basically everything that happened over the summer and the year and the protests and the movements. Well, Republicans just spent much of the fall campaigning on supporting police officers. And so, those things don't need to be at odds with each other. I mean, I want to say that because it's true, but ultimately they've been constructed in such a way so that they are. And so, it's hard, I think even as much as it's easy to say, well, maybe, people want to keep, let's say, keep cool around this area or not let it boil over. It just seems like an issue in which it's going to be hard for them. I would say it'd be hard to have a ceasefire at this point on this issue
Well, I
across the
mean, yeah, I
parties.
mean, I think at a basic level, Republicans, you say Republicans campaign, many Republicans, particularly in the legislature, campaigned on,
Especially in suburban districts.
supporting the police. And there have already been many bills filed that are important to many Democrats about a very different vision of, shall we say, police reform,
Mhm.
um, as well as, other issues that are related, engage, that raise the issue of race, public monuments, other
Mhm.
things, but also, frankly, again, healthcare delivery in response to COVID because of the disparate impact on communities of color. So I think, you know, I should probably, revise my remarks, and that it's not that nobody, that people are not going to want to raise the issue. They're not going to want it. Everyone's going to have such a fundamentally different view of how the issue plays out. And can you really find some kind of, discourse where you can implement policies in this way, or even debate them in a way.
Well,
And
that's the real challenge, right?
yeah,
Because I mean, ultimately, I think the last couple of days there's an announcement by the Biden administration about how they would, think about distribution of resources, and it mentioned race and gender as a particular factor for small businesses, and much of the response, on the right was that's racist. Setting aside that claim, the point being that, for most Democrats looking to advance social justice, whether in policing or otherwise, generally the modern sort of take on this is that you can't be race neutral anymore. You have to acknowledge where there are disparities and you have to address them head on. But the reality is that within the Republican Party, the response to that is, well, that approach is racist.
right.
Not a
And
lot
we've
of
not.
room, not a lot of room to maneuver there.
Yeah, and so I think that that discourse is just that discursive kind of conflict, which is also a very material political conflict, are both kind of lurking out there and just waiting to be activated in this legislative session. And they're the kinds of issues that are going to be hard to avoid, given the sense of urgency here, and given the
Well,
fact that this is not your regular legislative session. The shortfall may only be about $1 billion and not 4 or 5, as we heard from the controller this week. Um,
still
but
shortfall.
it's still going to be, that's a pretty relative judgment.
Yeah.
And it is still going to be a tense session. And there are a lot of issues that are very fundamental to the kind of cultural identity of the state. And that brings us really, also or cultural politics in the state. And that really brings us full circle to where we started and what has been going on in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
Because, at the end of the day, when you look at, the ground forces that were invading the Capitol and the composition of those groups, there is a racial component to that is undeniable and is bubbling under into the most discontented elements that are refusing to accept the transition, and that are for the time being located more or less either within or adjacent to the Republican Party.
And of
And that's
course,
why we saw Ted Cruz take the leadership he did in questioning the results of the election.
mhm.
That's why we saw more than half of the Republicans in the Texas, congressional delegation also voting to object to the electoral college results, and taking place in that, and for many of them in their public performances, being, for lack of a better term, as Trumpy as possible, and repeating the notion that their constituents had been robbed. And there's a racial component to that is fueling a lot of this, that has to do with some of the fundamentals in both American politics, but in state politics, for which, we started by talking, well, this urban rural divide. I mean, the urban rural divide is in part about a kind of, cultural positioning, or a culture,
Mhm.
different cultural milieus, but it's also very much about race.
Well, I'm reluctant to say this, but it's one of these things. You study political science, and for whatever reason, race and politics is sort of it's somewhat separate. I mean, it's a subset of American politics. It's a different thing. But I mean, I think in the last few years, if not in all of American history, I keep finding myself coming back to the notion: isn't all American politics about race and politics?
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's been a lot written in recent years about the fact that we separate the discussion of race and politics from quote unquote political science or
right.
mainstream political science is actually an artifact of what we're talking about.
Ooh. Right.
So,
one thing that you said that relates to this conversation, I want to make sure you hit it, is also and redistricting.
Yeah. Well, and redistricting, again, fundamental. Two things about redistricting that you raise, right? One, it's basically fundamental to everybody. It's fundamental to the electoral process. There's some really good language about that in Steve Bickerstaff's posthumously published review of redistricting that I've been reading at. And, but the 2 points he makes are, it's really the way that district lines are drawn are a fundamental aspect of democratic representation. And to the extent that we tolerate gerrymandering, we're tolerating compromises of democratic representation. And then the second point being that in almost all instances, race is fundamental to gerrymandering and redistricting, particularly in Texas, given our demographics.
I have to say, I like this. We're tolerating compromises of democratic representation. Sounds so quaint in the moment we're sitting in.
Yeah, well, yes, it is. And since we're, the underlying fundamentals have been questioned right now. They announced today that the legislature, that the two chambers will have organizational and rules meetings over the next couple of days. House, I didn't hear this on the Senate, but the House is adjourned, I think, until January 26th, at least for now. We will see if even that they hit that date, depending on, as you say, what happens with, everybody being together today and what happens out in the environment, given the pandemic. So we'll have a chance to return to some of these issues. Thanks for being here. Thanks to our crew in the Liberal Arts Development Studio in the College of Liberal Arts, University of Texas at Austin. We had some mid-show technical difficulties that I bet none of you will even notice because these guys and gals are so good. So thanks for listening, and we will be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. Be safe and be well. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.